Turn this ruined dish into a masterpiece. I'll give you $1M. Richard Whitmore's voice rang out through the sweltering heat of the kitchen. With 2 fingers, he pushed the plate toward Annie Johnson, as if the food itself had personally offended him. So, he said, looking down at her with contempt, do we have a deal? $1 million is a very generous offer for a girl who does nothing but stand beside the man who just ruined my dinner. Annie did not answer right away. Her father, Marcus Johnson, stepped forward. His hands were still wet from the sink. His apron was stained with butter, flour, and the tired marks of a long day's work. Mr. Whitmore, Marcus said, trying to keep his voice calm, I didn't mean for this to happen. The tray shifted near the stove, and I was trying to save the sauce before the dinner rush got worse. It was my fault. Sir, a serious mistake, but not disrespect. Richard turned toward him so sharply that the cooks behind them froze. A mistake? He repeated. Do you think I came here tonight to invest millions of dollars in a restaurant just so I could accept a dish served with the excuse of a mistake? Marcus swallowed hard, but he did not lower his head. No, sir. I'm only saying I can make it again. You already had your chance. I can still cook it again. Richard gave a cold laugh and turned back to Annie. Do you hear your father? Now he can cook it again. After serving my partner's burnt bread and bitter sauce, Chef Daniel Reed, the head chef of Magnolia Crown, stepped closer. He was over 60, with silver hair showing beneath his white chef's hat. Mr. Whitmore, he said, Marcus has worked here for 16 years. He is one of the reasons this restaurant still has its reputation in Charleston. Give us 10 minutes, and I will personally make sure. I don't need explanations, Richard snapped. I need competence. He picked up the ruined plate and held it in front of Annie. Would you like to taste it? He asked. Go ahead. This is your father's masterpiece. The dish he cooked for me. Then he threw his head back and laughed. Ha ha, can you believe it? A masterpiece of failure, served on fine china. Richard's laughter echoed through the kitchen, loud and unpleasant. But no one laughed with him. Marcus stood motionless. His jaw was clenched. His hands gripped the towel tight around his waist, as if it were the only thing keeping him from stepping forward. Annie looked at the plate, then at her father. My father didn't do it on purpose, she said. Her voice was soft, but clear enough for the entire kitchen to hear. He has worked here for years. He would never send out a ruined dish unless something had truly gone wrong. The smile vanished from Richard's face. His eyes narrowed. I don't listen to excuses, he said, each word pressed tightly through his teeth. People like your father always have a reason. The tray slipped. The stove was too hot. The kitchen was too busy. The whole world is unfair to them. Marcus took one step forward. Sir, I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm asking you not to punish the entire restaurant because of one plate of food. That was the moment the polished mask Richard had been wearing finally cracked. His face turned red. He swung one hand so sharply that he almost knocked over a bowl of herbs beside him. Enough, he shouted. Enough with the explanations. I gave you both a chance to save this dish, and yet you are still standing here talking. I don't like speeches. I don't like begging, and I especially don't like people who use excuses as seasoning to cover up failure. The entire kitchen went silent. Richard pointed at Annie, then at Marcus. There is only one choice. Either she accepts the challenge, or both of you leave this restaurant tonight. Marcus's voice dropped. Don't speak to my daughter like that. Richard stepped closer. Then stop hiding behind her. Annie felt her father tense beside her. She knew that look in his eyes. It was the look of a man who had swallowed too much disrespect in his life. So much that one more drop could make everything break. She gently placed her hand on his arm. Then she looked straight at Richard. If I say yes, Annie asked, are you sure you'll keep your word? Richard frowned. What did you say? You said you would give me $1 million if I could turn this ruined dish into a masterpiece. Are you sure? Because people like you often say things like that in front of a crowd, and when poor people actually win, they call it a joke. Richard's face hardened. Careful, little girl. I am being careful, Annie replied. That's why I'm asking. Will you keep your word, or will you change your mind afterward? For a few seconds, the only sound left was the sizzling of a pan on the stove. Then Richard turned toward a young woman in a navy blue suit standing near the service door. It was Claire Morgan, his assistant. Until then, she had remained silent, holding her tablet tightly against her chest. Claire, Richard said, take out your phone. Claire hesitated. Mr. Whitmore? I said take out your phone. She did. Record this. Claire opened the recording app and raised the phone. Richard straightened the collar of his jacket, as though he were about to deliver a public statement instead of cornering a young woman in the heat of a crowded kitchen. He looked directly at Annie. My name is Richard Charles Whitmore, founder and chairman of Whitmore Hospitality Group. I am standing in the kitchen of Magnolia Crown in Charleston, South Carolina. I am making this statement voluntarily in front of everyone present. If Annie Johnson can turn the dish her father ruined into an excellent dish, by my judgment, within 5 minutes, I will pay her $1 million. If she fails, she and Marcus Johnson will leave this restaurant tonight, and my investment in Magnolia Crown will be withdrawn. He paused, then smirked. Is that formal enough? Annie looked straight into his eyes. Yes, sir. Marcus turned to her. Annie, no. You don't have to do this. Richard smiled coldly again. Your father is right. You don't have to. You can leave with him. Annie did not move. She quietly picked up a clean spoon. Richard raised an eyebrow. Now you want to taste it? I need to know what I'm fixing. She scooped up a small bite and put it in her mouth. The bottom of the bread was scorched. The sauce was too sharp. The sweetness was almost gone. But underneath all the damage, Annie could still recognize the familiar traces of her father's seasoning. There was still care in it, still heart, still a dish that could have been beautiful before everything slipped out of control. Annie set the spoon down. It can still be saved. Richard chuckled. By you? Yes. Marcus stepped closer. Annie, listen to me. You don't need to prove anything to him. No, she said softly, but I need to prove something to myself. Chef Daniel's voice came from behind her, low and warm. Think carefully, kid. Annie did not turn around. I am. Richard glanced at the clock on the wall. 5 minutes. Annie pulled the ruined plate closer. She looked around the kitchen, the place she had spent her whole life dreaming of belonging to. Then she tied a clean apron tightly around her waist, lifted her head, and looked straight at Richard Whitmore. Start counting, she said. 5 minutes, Richard said, while Claire's phone kept recording. Chef Daniel glanced at the clock on the wall. Your time starts. Now. The kitchen came alive at once. Annie pulled the plate toward her and quickly examined the dish. The bottom of the pudding was burnt and bitter, but the center was still warm. The bourbon apple sauce had been overcooked, leaving it sharp and harsh. The pork was almost beyond saving, but a few edges were browned enough to hold a trace of smoke and salt. She could not remake the entire dinner in 5 minutes, so she stopped thinking like a student trying to pass a test. She started thinking like a chef. Small pan, Annie said. A cook named Ray slid one across the counter before she had even finished speaking. Heavy cream, brown sugar, butter, cinnamon, salt, peaches. Chef Daniel pointed once. Give her everything she asks for. A young kitchen assistant hurried to the lower cabinet and pulled out a bowl of sliced peaches left over from dessert service. Another set down a carton of heavy cream. Annie's hands moved quickly. She cut away the burnt bottom of the pudding. Anything ruined had to be removed. Marcus stood beside her, watching as she trimmed off the scorched edges. Use the center, he whispered. I know. Don't overwork it. I know, Dad. Marcus closed his mouth, but his eyes stayed fixed on his daughter's hands. There was worry in them, and hope, and a kind of pride he was trying hard not to show too soon. Richard stood near the walkway with his arms crossed. She has already wasted 2 minutes. It's only been 40 seconds, Claire blurted out before she could stop herself. Richard turned his head sharply. Claire lowered the phone slightly. I'm sorry, sir. Keep recording. Yes, sir. Annie dropped the butter into the pan. It melted quickly, bubbling around the edges. She added brown sugar, a pinch of salt, and just enough cream to soften the sauce. The smell changed first. The bitter scent faded into warm caramel. Then came cinnamon, then peaches. For one brief moment, the whole kitchen seemed to slow down. Ray muttered, Lord have mercy. Annie heard him, but she did not smile. She tore the usable pieces of pudding into large chunks and placed them into the pan, letting them soak up the sauce. Then she took what remained of the bourbon sauce from the original plate, tasted it once more, and added only a small spoonful. Chef Daniel leaned closer. Careful. It needs a little bite, Annie said. Otherwise it's just sweet. She turned each piece once, letting the edges crisp. Then she cut off a small piece of pork, sliced it thin, and fried it in a separate corner of the pan until it became almost like bacon, salty, smoky, and crisp. Richard's expression began to change. The contempt in his eyes slowly turned into irritation. Annie understood why. He had expected panic. He had expected trembling hands. He had expected failure. But she was not falling apart. She was cooking. 3 minutes, Chef Daniel said. Annie reached for a white plate. Without thinking, Marcus wiped a fingerprint from the rim before setting it in front of her. It was such a small gesture, but it nearly made Annie lose her composure. Even if everything was falling apart, he was still her father. "Thank you, Dad," she said softly. "Don't thank me," Marcus replied. "Finish it." Annie placed the warm bread pudding in the center of the plate, spooned the peaches around it, drizzled the creamy caramel sauce over the top, and sprinkled the crisp pork crumbs lightly across the dish. At a glance, they almost looked like toasted pecans. But she still needed one more thing. Not more sugar, not more cream. "Orange zest?" she asked. "No oranges on this station," Ray answered. "Lemon, behind you." Annie grabbed the lemon and grated a little zest over the plate. Just a touch, but the whole dish lifted. The bitterness finally had somewhere to go. The sweetness had balance. The smoke no longer felt rough. 4 minutes, Chef Daniel said. Annie wiped the edge of the plate, stepped back, and looked at what she had made. It was no longer Marcus's original dish. It was something else. Warm bread, caramel, peaches, smoke, salt, and memory. Annie carried the plate to Richard. The entire kitchen parted to let her through. Richard looked down at the dish. "This is not what I ordered." "No, sir," Annie said. "What you ordered was ruined. This is the best thing that could be made from what was left." Richard's jaw tightened. "You have a habit of answering more than you are asked, and you have a habit of asking for less than what is truly needed." A faint sound passed through the kitchen. It was not quite laughter. Chef Daniel raised a hand to his mouth and pretended to cough. Claire's eyes widened behind the phone. Richard picked up the spoon. "If this is another excuse dressed up as confidence." "Taste it," Annie said. Richard stared at her. For 1 second, Annie thought he might throw the entire plate onto the floor, fire everyone in the room, and walk away with the $1 million check still in his pocket. But he did not. Richard took one bite. At first, nothing happened. His face remained cold. His shoulders stayed straight. He chewed once. Slowly. Then again. The spoon lowered halfway to the plate and stopped there. Annie watched his eyes. Then Richard took another bite. This one was smaller. The kitchen held its breath. Richard's fingers tightened around the spoon. His face went pale. His lips parted, but no insult came out. Claire lowered the phone slightly. "Mr. Whitmore?" He did not answer her. Annie felt Marcus step closer behind her, but he did not touch her. Maybe he was afraid that even the smallest movement might break the moment. Everyone seemed afraid of the same thing. Richard took a third bite. This time, his hand trembled. The man who had laughed at Annie, the man who had threatened her father's job and the future of the restaurant, turned his face slightly away, as if the room had suddenly become too small. His throat tightened. He blinked hard. When he looked back at Annie, the anger in his eyes had not completely disappeared, but it had lost its power. "What did you put in this?" he asked. Annie answered carefully. "Heavy cream, brown sugar, cinnamon, peaches, a little bourbon sauce, salt, lemon zest, and the part of the pudding that could still be saved." "No," Richard said, almost in a whisper. "That's not what I meant." Marcus frowned. "Sir?" Only then did Richard look at him. Really look at him. Not as a chef who had disappointed him. Not as a man he could fire with a single sentence. But as another human being standing beneath the same light. "This tastes..." Richard stopped. The kitchen remained silent. He set the spoon down, then picked it up again, as if he did not trust his own hands unless they were holding something. "My mother used to make something like this," he said. "If this story touched your heart, please like this video and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. And if you believe kindness can change lives, subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories." No one spoke. Richard pressed his lips together, but the tears came anyway. One rolled down his cheek before he could stop it. He wiped it away with the back of his hand. Annie's voice softened. "Was she a chef?" Richard gave a quiet laugh, but this time, there was no cruelty in it. "No, she cleaned offices during the day. At night, if there was enough flour left, She baked. He looked down at the plate. We didn't have much. Stale bread, canned peaches if she could afford them, a little milk, cinnamon only on Sundays. He swallowed hard. She made it whenever she wanted me to believe we weren't poor. Marcus lowered his head. Chef Daniel drew in a slow breath through his nose. Richard rubbed the corners of his eyes, then turned to Claire. "Stop recording." Claire hesitated. "Sir, but the agreement—" I said stop recording. Annie's shoulders stiffened. Richard saw it, and this time, he understood immediately. "Not because I'm taking back my word," he said. His voice had changed. It was rougher now, more real. "I want the recording stopped because I don't want my mother's name sitting in someone's phone like a business memo." Claire stopped the recording. Annie still stood her ground. "You promised." Richard looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Yes, I did." Marcus exhaled softly, as if he had been holding his breath since the moment the plate left the stove. Richard turned to him. "Your daughter saved your dish." Marcus answered quietly. "No, she saved more than that." The kitchen stayed quiet long after Richard finished speaking. No one rushed back to their stations. No one called tickets. The smell of caramel, cinnamon, and warm peaches still hung in the air between them, as if the dish had become something larger than food. Richard looked at the plate again. "There was a blue enamel pot," he said suddenly. Claire blinked. "Sir?" He did not look at her. "My mother used it every Sunday." He turned the spoon in his hand slowly. "Cheap thing, chipped on one side." She refused to throw it away. He gave a short laugh. She said broken things still had work left in them. Marcus stood motionless. Richard continued, though it felt less like speaking and more like remembering aloud. "She worked cleaning offices downtown, came home after dark, still cooked." He looked toward Annie. "We weren't poor all the time, just most of the time." Annie said nothing. Some stories were not meant to be interrupted. Chef Daniel quietly signaled the cooks back to work, but even then they moved softly. Ray returned to his station without taking his eyes off Richard. Claire lowered her phone completely. For the first time that evening, she looked less like an assistant and more like someone watching her boss become a stranger. Richard finally set the spoon down. "Claire." "Yes, sir?" "Transfer the money." The entire kitchen froze again. Claire stared at him. "Sir?" "The 1 million. Silence." Marcus spoke first. "No." Every head turned. Richard looked up slowly. Marcus stepped forward. "No, sir." "Excuse me?" "My daughter didn't do this for money." Annie turned toward him. "Dad." Marcus shook his head gently. "We need money," he said quietly. "God knows we do. But I won't let her stand here feeling like she earned this because you challenged her." Richard studied him. "You're refusing $1 million?" Marcus let out a tired breath. "I'm refusing the idea that my child has to be humiliated before someone notices what she can do." The words settled over the kitchen. Chef Daniel looked down. Ray stopped chopping entirely. Richard's face tightened, but not with anger. Something else. Something heavier. "You think I humiliated her," he said. Marcus answered honestly. "You laughed at her. You laughed at me. In front of everyone." Richard opened his mouth, closed it. For the first time since entering the kitchen, he had no answer ready. Annie stepped beside her father. "We're not refusing help," she said softly. "We just don't want pity." Richard looked at her. "Do I look like a man giving pity?" "No," Annie said. "You look like a man remembering someone." That landed harder than anything else had. Claire slowly lowered her eyes. Richard turned away, walking toward the stainless prep table. He rested both hands against it and stood there for several seconds. The billionaire everyone feared suddenly looked very tired. Finally, he spoke without turning. "My mother died when I was 19. No one moved. I was in culinary school." His voice was steady now, but stripped clean. "I thought getting out would save us. I thought success would fix everything." He laughed once under his breath. She never saw any of it. Annie remembered her own mother then. 9 years gone, still present every time cinnamon touched butter, still alive in recipes, still sitting somewhere inside her father's hands. Richard turned back. "How long have you been apprenticing?" 8 months. "And before that?" "Learning from my dad." Marcus smiled faintly, since she could reach the counter. Richard nodded once. Then he looked towards Chef Daniel. "How much does she make here?" Daniel frowned. "She's an apprentice." "That wasn't my question." Daniel hesitated. Nothing yet. Richard looked back at Annie. Of course. Claire shifted awkwardly. Richard reached inside his jacket, pulled out a business card, and set it on the counter. Whitmore Culinary Foundation. Annie stared at it. What is this? Marcus asked. A scholarship program. Marcus looked up sharply. Richard met Annie's eyes. You said your father taught you how. He glanced at the empty plate. I'd like to see how far you can go. The kitchen became quiet again. Annie did not touch the card. Marcus didn't either. Richard noticed. You don't trust me. Marcus answered before Annie could. You threatened to fire me 30 minutes ago. A small sound escaped Claire. It might have been a laugh she tried to hide. Even Chef Daniel's mouth twitched. Richard looked unexpectedly embarrassed. Yes, he admitted. That happened. It did. And I was wrong. Nobody had expected those words. Not Ray. Not Daniel. Not Claire. Not even Richard himself, judging by his expression after saying them. Marcus stared at him. You're apologizing? Richard straightened his jacket. Don't make a ceremony out of it. Ray quietly muttered. Lord, write this date down. Several cooks looked away to hide smiles. Richard ignored them. He walked toward Marcus and stopped. I won't withdraw my investment. Chef Daniel exhaled. The restaurant stays? It stays. Marcus lowered his head for a second. 16 years. Mortgages. Staff salaries. The old roof. The failing freezer. Everything that had been hanging over Magnolia Crown all month suddenly loosened. Richard looked around the kitchen. You people built something worth saving. His eyes moved to Annie. Tonight she reminded me why. He started toward the dining room, then stopped. Without turning back, he asked quietly, The dish. Annie looked up. What would you call it? She thought for a moment. My mom used to save stale bread every week, she said. She'd turn it into dessert on Sundays. Richard waited. She called it second chance bread. The kitchen fell silent again. Richard stood very still. Then he nodded once and walked out. Claire hurried after him before stopping beside Annie. She looked at the empty plate, then at the business card still lying untouched. He doesn't carry those, she said quietly. Annie frowned. What? The cards. Claire glanced toward the dining room doors. He stopped carrying them years ago. She followed Richard out. Marcus and Annie remained standing under the kitchen lights. Chef Daniel picked up the card and placed it gently into Annie's hand. You know, he said, I've worked kitchens 40 years. Annie looked at him. I've seen rich people cry. He nodded toward the dining room, but never over bread pudding. Marcus laughed softly for the first time that night. Then he put one hand on Annie's shoulder. His voice was low. Your mother would have been proud. Annie looked down at the card in her hand. Whitmore Culinary Foundation. The letters blurred for a second, not because of the kitchen heat, because somewhere beyond the dining room doors, a man had walked in ready to destroy everything, and left carrying a memory instead. Dinner service ended almost an hour later. The noise returned little by little. Orders moved again. Plates left the pass. Guests laughed beyond the dining room doors as if nothing unusual had happened. But inside the kitchen, people kept stealing glances at Annie. Ray passed her carrying a stack of trays. You realize half this staff's gonna tell that story for the next 20 years? Annie smiled faintly. I'd rather they forget it. Ray snorted. Nobody forgets the night a billionaire cried over bread pudding. Marcus was wiping down his station when Chef Daniel approached. Office, Daniel said. Marcus looked up immediately. Now? Now. The old fear returned so fast Annie felt it in her own stomach. Marcus untied his apron. Annie, I'll finish here. He nodded once and followed Daniel toward the back hallway. The kitchen suddenly felt larger without him. Annie started stacking bowls just to keep her hands moving. The business card still sat folded inside her apron pocket. She had touched it twice already just to make sure it was real. A scholarship, the word did not fit inside her head yet. She was rinsing the last pan when someone cleared their throat behind her. Claire Morgan stood there holding a paper bag from the dining room. You didn't eat. Annie blinked. What? Claire lifted the bag slightly. Chef sent dinner home for staff. You were busy saving rich men from emotional collapse. Annie laughed before she could stop herself. Claire smiled for the first time. You laugh like your father, she said. Is that good? Depends who you ask. They stood in silence for a moment. Claire looked toward the office hallway. He means the scholarship. Annie touched the pocket unconsciously. You know him well? 12 years. And? Claire leaned against the prep table. And I've never seen him carry those cards. You said that already. I meant it. She looked directly at Annie. He stopped because nobody ever reminded him of his mother. Annie lowered her eyes. My mom died too. Claire's expression softened. How old were you? 9. Claire nodded slowly. Mr. Whitmore was 19. Before Annie could answer, the office door opened. Marcus came out first. He wasn't walking. He was floating. Chef Daniel followed behind him with his hands in his pockets, trying very hard not to smile. Marcus stopped in front of Annie. Dad? He looked at her for 3 full seconds, then suddenly pulled her into a hug. Not the quick shoulder tap he usually gave. A real hug, the kind fathers save for funerals, graduations, and miracles. What happened? Marcus stepped back. They promoted me. Anya started. What? Assistant kitchen manager. He laughed once in disbelief. Starting next month. Ray dropped a tray. What? Half the staff turned around. Chef Daniel finally gave up pretending to be calm. Mr. Whitmore made the call before dessert service ended. Marcus still looked stunned. He said anyone who raises talent like this doesn't belong hiding in the back station forever. Annie covered her mouth. Ray walked over shaking his head. Man burned 1 dessert and got promoted. Watch your mouth, Marcus said, laughing. No, seriously, I burn stuff every week. Chef Daniel pointed a finger at him. And that's why you're still on vegetables. The kitchen burst into laughter. For the first time all night, it felt normal again. Almost. Marcus reached into his apron pocket. I forgot. He pulled out a small notebook bound in faded brown leather. Annie's breath caught. Her mother's recipe book. Marcus ran his thumb over the cover. I brought it today. He looked down at it. Don't know why. Annie took the book carefully. The edges were worn. Flour still lived in the seams. Inside, the handwriting slanted gently across yellow pages. Cinnamon bread. Sunday peach cobbler. Church pot roast. Second chance bread. Annie stopped there. The page had stains near the corner. Her mother's note sat underneath. Stale bread isn't failure. It's just bread waiting for another story. Annie swallowed. Marcus looked away. I haven't opened that page in years. Chef Daniel quietly stepped back, giving them space. Claire stood near the door watching. Your mother wrote that? She asked softly. Marcus nodded. She hated wasting food. No, Annie said. Everyone looked at her. She hated wasting people. The room went quiet again. Marcus smiled. That too. Someone knocked lightly against the open kitchen door. One of the servers leaned in. Mr. Whitmore is leaving. No one moved. Then the server added quietly. He asked if Annie's still here. Claire straightened. Marcus looked at Annie. Annie closed the recipe book. Richard Whitmore stood near the front entrance when she reached the dining room. The restaurant was almost empty now. Chairs had begun going onto tables. The candles had burned low. He had his coat on. The billionaire looked different outside the kitchen. Smaller somehow. Not poorer. Just less armored. He turned when he heard her footsteps. For a second, neither spoke. Then Richard reached into his coat pocket and took something out. A small silver watch. Old. Scratched. The chain worn smooth. My mother's, he said. Annie looked at it. She used to check this every Sunday while baking. He smiled faintly. Said good bread needs patience and children need more. Annie smiled. Richard closed the watch and put it away. I wanted to say something before I left. She waited. He looked toward the kitchen doors behind her. Tonight. He paused. You didn't save dinner. Annie frowned. You saved a memory I thought money had buried. The dining room stayed quiet. Richard nodded once. Then he walked toward the exit. Halfway there he stopped. Without turning back he said, Keep the card, and left. Annie stood alone beneath the dim dining room lights. Behind her, the kitchen waited. Ahead of her, the front doors slowly closed. For the first time since her mother died, the future no longer looked like something far away. It looked like a road that had finally opened. The next morning, Annie woke before her alarm. For a moment she did not remember why her chest felt so tight. Then she saw her apron folded on the chair, the corner of her mother's recipe book beside it, and Richard Whitmore's business card lying on top like something that had fallen out of another life. She sat up slowly. The house was quiet except for the old refrigerator clicking in the kitchen and a truck passing outside on the street. Their home was small, 1 story, with a porch Marcus had promised to repaint every spring for the last 6 years. The floors creaked in familiar places. The curtains in the kitchen had faded from yellow to almost white. Nothing about it looked different. But Annie did. She walked into the kitchen and found Marcus already awake, standing at the stove in sweatpants and an old Magnolia Crown t-shirt. Bacon snapped in the skillet. Coffee steamed beside him. The radio played low, some old soul song her mother used to hum when Sundays felt easy. "You're up early," he said without turning. "So are you. I'm old. We do that. You're 54. That's old when your knees sound like bubble wrap." Annie smiled and sat at the table. Marcus placed a plate in front of her. Scrambled eggs, toast, 2 strips of bacon, and half a peach he had warmed in butter and cinnamon. Not fancy, better than fancy. She looked at it for a while. Marcus noticed. "What?" "Nothing. Annie, it smells like last night." His face softened. "I know." He poured coffee into his mug, then sat across from her. For a few seconds, neither of them ate. Sunlight came through the kitchen window and touched the worn recipe book between them. Marcus tapped the cover with one finger. "Your mother would have made a fuss. She would have cried? She would have cried, prayed, called 3 aunties, then told everybody at church you saved a restaurant with stale bread." Annie laughed, but it caught in her throat. Marcus reached across the table and touched her hand. "You scared me last night." "I know. No, I mean you really scared me." His voice dropped. "Not because you cooked. Because you stepped in front of a man who had power over our lives and acted like fear didn't exist. I was afraid." "I know that too." She looked down at her plate. "I couldn't watch him talk to you like that." Marcus leaned back. "Baby, I've had people talk down to me before. That doesn't make it right." "No," he nodded. "It doesn't." The silence that followed was not empty. It had years in it. Years of Marcus coming home tired and still asking about her homework. Years of Annie watching bills get stacked under magnets on the refrigerator. Years of both of them pretending loss was smaller if they kept busy. Marcus picked up Richard's card. "You want this?" Annie stared at it. "I don't know. That's not what I asked." "I want it," she admitted. "I'm just afraid wanting it too much makes me stupid." Marcus studied her the way he did when a sauce was close to breaking. "Hope doesn't make you stupid. People with money can change their minds." That part is true. He could wake up today and decide last night was embarrassing. Marcus turned the card in his hand. "Maybe. Then what? Then we remain who we were before he walked in." Annie looked at him. He pushed the card back toward her. "But if a door opens, don't refuse to look through it because somebody rich built the frame." She smiled a little. "That sounds like something Mom would say." "No. Your mama would have said, 'Girl, take the scholarship and stop overthinking breakfast.'" Annie laughed for real this time. Marcus's phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at it, and his face changed. "What is it?" Annie asked. He picked it up. "It's Chef Daniel." He answered on speaker. "Morning, Chef." Daniel's voice came through rough and awake. "You sitting down?" Marcus looked at Annie. "Should I be?" "Probably." Annie's smile faded. Daniel continued. "Richard Whitmore's office called 20 minutes ago. Contract papers are being delivered this afternoon." Marcus blinked. "The investment? Signed in principle. Legal review next week, but he's moving forward." Annie covered her mouth. Daniel wasn't finished. "And there's more. He wants a meeting with Annie at the restaurant today." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "What kind of meeting?" He didn't say much. "Claire said it concerns the foundation." Marcus looked at Annie. Daniel added, "Marcus, before you get protective, I already told them she doesn't meet anybody without you present." "Thank you." "Don't thank me. I may be old, but I'm not foolish." Annie leaned closer to the phone. "Chef?" "Morning, kid. Is everyone talking about last night?" Daniel snorted. "Everyone?" Ray has told the story 4 times, and he wasn't even telling it right. According to him, you flambéed a peach while staring down a billionaire like John Wayne. "I did not flambe anything." "I know." I corrected him. He was disappointed. Marcus shook his head. Daniel's voice softened. "You did well, Annie. But today, keep your feet on the floor. Big promises look good under restaurant lights. In daylight, read every word." "Yes, Chef." "Good. Be here at noon." The call ended. For a while, neither father nor daughter spoke. Then Marcus stood and carried his plate to the sink, though he had barely eaten. "Dad? I'm thinking. That usually means you're worried. I raised you. Worry is part of the job." She walked over and stood beside him. "You don't want me to go?" "I want you to go. He rinsed his mug. I just don't want you walking into someone else's plan without knowing the cost. Annie nodded. He turned off the water and looked at her. Last night, you protected me. Today, let me protect you. She held his gaze. Okay. At 11:30, they pulled into the alley behind Magnolia Crown. The same brick walls, the same back door, the same delivery crates stacked near the service entrance. But Annie felt different walking in. People stopped what they were doing. A dishwasher grinned. One server gave her a thumbs up. Ray bowed so low he almost hit his head on a shelf. Chef Annie, he said, don't start. I'm just respecting greatness. You're respecting gossip. That too. Chef Daniel came out of his office with 2 folders under one arm. Enough, he said, though his eyes were amused. She's still an apprentice. Apprentices peel potatoes. Ray pointed at Annie. $1 million potatoes now. Daniel glared at him. Ray went back to work. Marcus leaned toward Annie. See? Fame ruins people by lunch. Annie almost smiled, but then Claire Morgan entered through the dining room doors. She wore the same navy suit from the night before, but her expression was less guarded. Good morning, she said. Marcus stepped forward. Where's Mr. Whitmore? On his way. Chef Daniel folded his arms. What's this about? Claire looked at Annie, then at Marcus. Mr. Whitmore wants to honor his promise. Marcus's face stayed still. Claire understood. The money is real, she said. So is the scholarship. But he also wants something else. Annie felt her stomach tighten. What? Claire opened her folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He wants permission to keep the recipe. Marcus looked at the paper. For his restaurants? No. Claire's voice softened. For himself. Before anyone could answer, the front door opened. Richard Whitmore walked in alone. No entourage. No hard smile. In his hand was a small silver watch. Richard Whitmore stopped just inside the dining room entrance. Morning light spilled through the front windows and caught the silver watch in his hand. Without the dark suit jacket from the night before, without investors behind him, he looked older. Not weak, just tired in places money never reached. Claire stepped aside. Marcus remained where he was. Annie noticed it immediately. Her father was polite, but he had moved half a step in front of her. Richard saw it too. That's fair, he said quietly. Marcus did not answer. Richard walked toward the nearest table and placed a leather folder on it. No lawyers, he said. No contracts. Chef Daniel crossed his arms. Good start. A small smile touched Richard's mouth. Then he looked at Annie. I came to keep my promise. He opened the folder. Inside sat a cashier's check. $1 million. Ray, who had been pretending to wipe a counter 10 feet away, nearly dropped the towel. Marcus stared at it but did not move. Annie felt the room go still around her. Richard slid the check forward. It's yours. Annie looked up. Just like that? No. Richard shook his head. Not just like that. He glanced around Magnolia Crown. It cost me a very expensive lesson. Chef Daniel muttered. Good lessons usually do. Richard ignored him. Marcus finally spoke. Why cash? Richard looked at him. Because I grew up poor. The answer came too quickly to be rehearsed. My mother never trusted promises. She trusted envelopes, receipts, and money she could hold. He nodded toward the check. So this is real. No one spoke for a second. Then Annie quietly asked, and the recipe? Richard's eyes moved to her. Yes. Claire handed him the paper. Richard did not take it immediately. Instead, he turned the silver watch over in his fingers. My mother used to make bread pudding every Sunday. His voice lowered. Not because we liked it. Because stale bread was cheaper than throwing food away. Marcus slowly relaxed his shoulders. Richard continued. She died before I could buy her anything better. He smiled once without humor. Funny thing about money. You spend half your life chasing it and the other half realizing it can't buy back a kitchen. The room stayed quiet. Richard finally took the paper from Claire. I don't want the recipe for business. He looked at Annie. I want to cook it at home. Ray whispered under his breath. Billionaire, cooking bread pudding. Didn't see that coming. Chef Daniel elbowed him. Marcus looked at Richard for a long moment. Then he walked to Annie. Get the book. Annie blinked. What? Your mother's recipe book. She hurried toward the office shelf where she had left it. When she returned, Marcus opened directly to the stained page. Second chance bread. He rested his hand over the paper. This wasn't my wife's recipe originally, he said quietly. Annie looked up. Marcus smiled faintly. It was mine. Everyone stared at him. Mom didn't create it? Oh, she changed it. Marcus laughed softly. Made it better too. His thumb brushed the edge of the page. But the first version came from me. Richard stepped closer. Marcus looked at the recipe. I was 21, broke. Burned dinner trying to impress her. He glanced toward Annie. Thought I ruined everything. Annie smiled. She tasted it anyway? Marcus nodded. She looked at me and said, stale bread isn't failure. It's just bread waiting for another story. Claire lowered her eyes. Even Chef Daniel stopped moving. Marcus turned the book toward Richard. She saved the dish. He pointed at Annie. She saved the memory. Then he closed the book. Richard stood there longer than anyone expected. Finally, he said quietly, may I copy it? Marcus looked at Annie. Not the billionaire. His daughter. Annie thought of the night before. The laughter. The threat. The tears. The silver watch. Then she nodded. Yes. Richard exhaled slowly. Claire immediately opened her folder to take notes. Not now, Richard said. She looked up. He smiled faintly. I'm cooking it myself. Ray almost choked. You cook? Richard turned. I survived before I became rich. The kitchen laughed. The tension finally broke. Chef Daniel walked toward the office. I'm getting coffee. This conversation needs caffeine. Ray followed instantly. I need to see this rich man recipe. You need work, Daniel answered. They disappeared. Marcus stayed near Annie. Richard looked around Magnolia Crown again. You know, he said quietly. My first job was washing dishes. Annie blinked. You? Yes. What happened? I got promoted. Marcus laughed unexpectedly. Richard looked at him. Marcus shrugged. That was funny. Claire looked genuinely shocked. Richard smiled. The expression sat awkwardly on him, like something unused. Then he reached into his coat pocket again. This time he took out a photograph. Old. Folded. A woman in a simple dress stood beside a stove holding a pie. Richard placed it carefully beside the recipe book. My mother. Annie picked it up gently. The woman looked tired. Warm. Real. Marcus looked at the picture for several seconds. She has kind eyes. Richard nodded. She fed half our neighborhood. Then Annie's dish makes sense. Richard looked up. Marcus smiled softly. Good food remembers good people. Silence settled again. Outside, a delivery truck rolled past. Inside Magnolia Crown, sunlight touched the old recipe book, the silver watch, and the photograph on the table. 3 kinds of memory. One from a wife, one from a mother, one from a daughter. Claire suddenly checked her phone. Her expression changed. Mr. Whitmore. He turned. You have a board meeting in 40 minutes. Richard barely reacted. She lowered the phone. They're asking if the investment is still moving. Marcus looked away. Richard reached for the photograph and the recipe page. Then he looked at Magnolia Crown one more time. Yes, he said. His voice was steady now. Tell them we're not just investing. Claire frowned. Richard glanced at Annie. We're protecting this place. No one spoke, because everyone in that room understood what he had really meant. He was not talking about the restaurant anymore. Richard left 20 minutes later. The photograph was back in his coat pocket. The silver watch disappeared with it. But the recipe page remained on the table. Not the original. Claire had carefully copied it by hand. Marcus watched them leave through the dining room windows. The black car pulled away quietly. Ray came out of the kitchen holding a coffee cup. So, he leaned against the wall. Anybody else feel like we all just adopted a billionaire? Chef Daniel walked past and smacked the back of his head with a folded towel. Go peel potatoes. Ray grinned and disappeared. The dining room settled into its normal rhythm again. Lunch prep started. Deliveries arrived. Someone argued about onions near the back station. But Annie noticed her father had gone quiet. He still held the recipe book. Still stood in the same spot. Dad? Marcus blinked. Sorry. You okay? He looked down at the page again. I haven't thought about your mother this much in years. Annie moved beside him. You miss her today? Marcus smiled faintly. I miss her every day. He closed the book gently. Today I just remembered it louder. Chef Daniel approached carrying 2 aprons. Enough feelings, he said. Lunch crowd comes in 40 minutes and emotions don't prep vegetables. Marcus laughed under his breath. Daniel handed Annie an apron. You're with me today. Annie blinked. Me? You saved dinner in front of a billionaire. He started walking toward the kitchen. "Congratulations. You get more work," Marcus called after him. "That promotion changed nothing, huh?" Daniel kept walking. "Not a thing." Annie followed him into the kitchen. The prep station already had ingredients waiting: peaches, cream, cinnamon sticks, apples, old brioche bread. She looked at the setup. "Bread pudding?" Daniel nodded. "Again?" "No." He tied his apron. "Today you learn why yours worked." Annie washed her hands. Daniel leaned against the counter. "You didn't save that dish because you cook well." She looked up. "You saved it because you understood the person eating it." Annie stayed quiet. Daniel picked up a peach. Most young cooks chase technique. Knife cuts, sauce work, fancy words. He sliced the peach cleanly in one motion. Older cooks chase memory. He handed her the knife. "Show me your mother." Annie frowned. "What?" "In food." The kitchen noise faded behind her. She looked down at the ingredients. Peaches, bread, cream, cinnamon. Her mother's kitchen smelled like cinnamon every Sunday. Her mother hummed while cooking. She always saved the ripest peaches for Annie. Annie picked up the knife. Marcus watched from across the room while organizing invoices near the office door. The first cut was steady, then another. Daniel nodded once. "Good." At that moment, the back door opened. Claire walked in carrying 2 garment bags. Everyone turned. Ray popped his head up instantly. "Oh no, rich people are back." Claire ignored him. "I'm looking for Annie." Annie wiped her hands. "What happened?" Claire set the bags on the prep table. "One is for your father." Marcus frowned. "One is for you." Nobody moved. Claire opened the first bag. Inside hung a dark chafe jacket. Embroidery across the chest. Marcus Johnson, assistant kitchen manager. Marcus stared. Ray let out a low whistle. Claire opened the second bag. White chef jacket. Simple, clean. Under the name, Annie Johnson. Below it, Whitmore Culinary Foundation candidate. The room went quiet. Annie touched the sleeve. "This is mine?" Claire nodded. "Mr. Whitmore asked me to bring it." Marcus looked up. "Why?" Claire smiled slightly. "He said people should dress for the future they earned." Ray immediately raised his hand. "Question." Nobody answered him. "Can rich people adopt adults?" Chef Daniel pointed toward the potatoes. "Move." Ray sighed dramatically and disappeared. Claire stepped closer to Annie. "There's something else." Annie looked up. "The foundation board wants to meet you next month." Marcus straightened immediately. "What kind of meeting?" "Interview, evaluation, scholarship review." Annie froze. Claire continued. "If accepted, tuition, housing, training, everything covered." The kitchen became still again. Marcus slowly sat down on the nearest stool. Annie looked at him. "Dad?" He rubbed one hand across his face. "You'd leave Charleston." The words came quietly. Nobody spoke. Annie looked down at the jacket in her hands. Charleston, Magnolia Crown, their house, her mother's garden, Sunday church, the kitchen where she learned everything. Claire seemed to understand. "It's only an opportunity," she said gently. Marcus nodded. "I know," but Annie heard it. The sadness under the words. Not anger, not refusal, loss. Chef Daniel broke the silence. "She's not leaving today." Everyone looked at him. He tied his apron tighter. "She still owes me 6 trays of prep." Ray shouted from the back. "And potatoes." The kitchen laughed. The tension loosened. Marcus stood again. He walked toward Annie. "Touch the jacket. You wear it." She looked up. "What?" He smiled. "Not today." He adjusted the collar lightly. "But someday." Annie swallowed. Claire quietly picked up her folder. "I should go." Marcus nodded. Before leaving, Claire paused beside him. "Mr. Whitmore asked me to tell you something." Marcus frowned. "What?" Claire smiled. "He said your wife would have been proud of both of you." Marcus stopped moving. Claire left. The kitchen returned to work. Knives moved. Pans heated. Orders started coming in. But Marcus remained standing for another moment, staring at the jacket in Annie's hands. Then very softly, almost too softly to hear, he said, "She would have loved seeing you wear white." Annie looked down at the embroidery. Her name, stitched into the future. And for the first time since that night began, the dream no longer felt borrowed. It felt possible. That night, Annie carried the white chef jacket home folded across her arms. Marcus drove slower than usual. Charleston moved past the truck windows in warm evening light. Small diners, brick storefronts. The old church near Meeting Street. Nothing had changed outside. Inside the cab, everything had. The jacket sat between them. Marcus glanced at it twice before finally speaking. You know what your mother did when she got her first real kitchen job? Annie looked over. What? She ironed her apron. Annie laughed. Marcus smiled at the road. 3 times. She ironed an apron? Twice front side. Once inside because she said confidence starts where nobody sees it. Annie looked down at the folded white cloth. You miss her a lot today. Marcus nodded. Yeah. The truck rolled into their driveway just as the porch light flickered on. Their neighbor, Mrs. Evelyn Carter, sat on her front steps with a bowl in her lap. She raised a hand. There they are. Marcus groaned softly. Uh-oh. Mrs. Carter crossed the yard before they reached the porch. At 72, she moved slowly but talked fast enough for 3 people. I heard. Annie blinked. Heard what? That my favorite girl made a billionaire cry. Marcus looked at the sky. It's all over the neighborhood already? Mrs. Carter held up her phone. Church group chat. Annie covered her face. Marcus laughed. Mrs. Carter handed over the bowl. Peach cobbler. Congratulations, dessert. You didn't have to do this. I know. She smiled. I wanted to. Her eyes dropped to the jacket in Annie's hands. The smile softened. Well now. Annie hesitated, then unfolded it. Mrs. Carter touched the embroidered name gently. Your mama would have framed this. Marcus looked away toward the porch. Nobody spoke for a second. Mrs. Carter squeezed Annie's hand. Don't let fear make decisions for you, baby. Then she walked back home carrying her empty bowl. Inside, the house smelled like old wood, coffee, and cinnamon still lingering from breakfast. Marcus set the cobbler on the counter. Annie placed the jacket carefully over the chair. Her mother's recipe book already waited there. 3 things in one kitchen. The book, the jacket, the future. Marcus opened the refrigerator. Want leftovers? Annie shook her head. Not hungry. You are. You're thinking. She smiled faintly. Marcus pulled out sweet tea anyway. They sat at the table. For a while, the only sound was ice shifting in glasses. Then Annie asked quietly, Would you really be okay if I left? Marcus looked at her. For school? For everything. He leaned back. You know why I taught you cooking? Because Mom asked you to? He smiled. That too. She waited. Because talent should travel farther than pain. The room stayed quiet. Marcus looked at his hands. I stayed here because your mother got sick. He shrugged gently. Then she died. Then you needed me. Life got smaller. Was that bad? No. He looked up immediately. Never think you were the reason I stayed. Then why does leaving feel like betrayal? Marcus took a long breath. Because home is heavy. The words sat between them. He continued. People think love means holding on. He looked toward the jacket. Sometimes love means helping someone pack. Annie looked down. The front porch creaked. Someone knocked. Marcus frowned. At this hour? He opened the door. Claire Morgan stood outside holding a cardboard bakery box. Both of them stared. Claire looked equally surprised. I didn't know how Southern people handled unannounced visitors. Marcus folded his arms. We judge quietly and invite you in anyway. Claire laughed. She held out the box. Mr. Whitmore baked. Silence. Marcus blinked. Anya started. Claire nodded with complete seriousness. He followed the recipe. Marcus slowly took the box. Did the kitchen survive? Barely. Annie laughed. Claire stepped inside. Marcus opened the box. Bread pudding. Uneven. Slightly burned on one edge. Everyone looked at it. Claire cleared her throat. He says the peaches won. Annie smiled despite herself. There was a folded note inside. Marcus handed it to her. The handwriting was neat. Your mother was right. Stale bread is not failure. Thank you for letting me remember. Richard. Annie read it twice. Marcus quietly sat down. Claire looked around the kitchen. Small house. Old cabinets. Recipe book on the table. White jacket over the chair. Her eyes rested there. He would hate this room, she said softly. Marcus looked up. What? Claire smiled. Because it explains too much. Nobody understood. She pointed at the table. The recipe book. Then the jacket. Then the cobbler. You people keep memories where you can reach them. The room fell quiet. Claire lowered her eyes. Mr. Whitmore keeps his in a vault. No one answered. Outside, Night settled over Charleston. Inside the kitchen, 4 people stood around a slightly burned bread pudding made by a billionaire who had forgotten how to lose. Marcus cut 4 slices. He handed one to Claire. Honnête to Annie. Kept one. The last stayed on the plate. Marcus took a bite first. Everyone watched. He chewed, then looked up. Well? Claire asked. Marcus nodded slowly. He needs work. Claire laughed so hard she almost dropped her fork. Annie looked down at Richard's note again. Thank you for letting me remember. She folded it carefully and slipped it inside her mother's recipe book. Somewhere between the old pages and new dreams, it felt like the right place to keep it. The next Sunday, the Johnson house smelled like cinnamon before sunrise. Annie woke to the sound of cabinet doors opening and closing. She stepped into the kitchen and stopped. Marcus stood at the counter wearing an apron she had not seen in years. Her mother's apron, light blue, small flowers near the pocket, faded at the edges. He was slicing stale bread. Annie leaned against the doorway. Morning. Marcus looked up. Morning. She nodded toward the apron. You found it. Back of the hall closet. He smiled faintly. Still had flour on it. Anya sat down. The recipe book lay open beside him. Second chance bread. Marcus mixed cream into a bowl. I figured your mother deserved breakfast. Annie watched him quietly. He had not cooked this recipe since the funeral. Not once. Outside, church bells drifted through the neighborhood. Marcus poured the custard over the bread. You know what she used to do? He asked. What? She always saved 1 peach. He smiled at the memory. Never used it. Why? She said every kitchen needs hope sitting on the counter. Annie laughed softly. A knock came at the front door. Marcus frowned. At 8 in the morning? Mrs. Carter's voice came through before either moved. Open up. I brought biscuits. Marcus laughed and opened the door. Mrs. Carter entered carrying a tray and immediately stopped. Her eyes landed on the apron. Oh. The room softened. Marcus looked down. She would have liked today. Mrs. Carter nodded once. She would have loved today. The 3 of them ate breakfast together. Biscuit, bread pudding, coffee, stories. Mrs. Carter told the same story about Annie burning grilled cheese at 12 and blaming the pan. Annie protested. Marcus sided with Mrs. Carter immediately. Halfway through breakfast, Annie's phone buzzed. Unknown number. She ignored it. It rang again. Marcus looked over. You gonna answer? Annie picked up. Hello? Silence. Then, Richard Whitmore's voice. Did I wake you? Annie nearly dropped the phone. Marcus raised an eyebrow. No, sir. Good. A pause. How's the bread pudding? Annie blinked. You know about that? I received a full report. His voice sounded amused. Apparently, I still need work. Mrs. Carter mouthed. Is that him? Annie nodded. Richard continued. I'm calling because I'd like to invite you and your father somewhere. Marcus stopped eating. Annie sat straighter. Where? My home. Silence. Even Mrs. Carter stopped moving. Annie thought she had misheard. Your house? Yes. Marcus spoke from across the table. Why? Richard answered without hesitation. I'd like to cook the recipe properly. Mrs. Carter covered her mouth. Marcus looked like someone had asked him to borrow the moon. Richard continued. And because I owe both of you dinner. Marcus took the phone gently. Mr. Whitmore. Marcus. I appreciate the offer. I know you don't trust me. Mrs. Carter slowly nodded to herself as if approving the honesty. Marcus looked toward Annie. Richard spoke again. My mother's birthday is tomorrow. The room went still. Marcus's expression changed. I haven't cooked for anyone since she died, Richard said quietly. I think I'd like not to be alone. Nobody spoke. Mrs. Carter lowered her eyes. Marcus held the phone for several seconds, then finally asked, What time? Annie looked up. Richard answered softly. 6. The call ended. Mrs. Carter sat back. Well, Marcus exhaled. Annie stared at him. We're going? He rubbed one hand across his face. I think we are. Mrs. Carter smiled. Your mother would go. Marcus laughed under his breath. Yeah. She'd bring dessert too. That afternoon, Annie stood in her room staring at the white chef jacket hanging by the closet. Whitmore Culinary Foundation candidate. She touched the stitching once, then looked at the recipe book on her desk. Inside, Richard's folded note remained tucked between the pages. Thank you for letting me remember. A soft knock came. Marcus leaned against the doorframe. You all right? Annie nodded. Just thinking. Dangerous hobby. She smiled. Marcus looked at the jacket. You nervous? A little. About dinner? No. She hesitated. About leaving. Marcus came inside. He sat on the edge of the bed. You know something your mother told me before she died? Annie looked up. She said, don't make our daughter small so she stays close. The room went quiet. Marcus looked at his hands. I've been trying not to do that ever since. Annie swallowed hard. You never did. He smiled. Good. The sun lowered outside. Charleston turned gold. In another part of the city, a billionaire who had spent years eating alone was setting a table for guests. And in a small house across town, a father folded his late wife's apron carefully and placed it back in the drawer. Tomorrow would be her birthday. For the first time in years, 3 people who missed someone were going to sit at the same table. Richard Whitmore's house stood near the water on the quieter side of Charleston. No gates, no fountain, no line of expensive cars. Annie noticed that first. Marcus noticed the porch light. It was already on. Claire opened the door before they knocked. You made it. Marcus held out the dessert dish in his hands. Mrs. Carter insisted nobody arrives empty. Handed. Claire looked inside. Peach cobbler? She threatened me. Claire smiled. Reasonable woman. The house was large but strangely simple. Dark wood floors. Bookshelves. Old photographs. A piano near the living room window. Nothing looked staged. Annie followed slowly. Her eyes stopped on the kitchen. It was warm. Used. A loaf of bread cooled near the counter. Cinnamon sat beside a mixing bowl. Flour still dusted one side of the island. Richard appeared carrying plates. He looked almost embarrassed. You're early. Marcus glanced at the wall clock. We're 2 minutes late. Richard set the plates down. Then I'm early. Claire quietly disappeared toward the dining room. Annie looked around. You baked today? Richard nodded. Twice. How'd it go? He considered the question. The smoke detector participated. Marcus laughed before he could stop himself. Richard looked at him. Marcus shrugged. Sorry. No, Richard said. That's fair. The tension eased. Dinner started simply. Roasted chicken. Green beans. Cornbread. Nothing fancy. No private chef. No staff serving wine. Richard carried dishes himself. Halfway through the meal, Annie finally asked what had been sitting in her mind all day. Why don't you have cooks? Richard cut his chicken slowly. I used to. What happened? I fired them. Marcus raised an eyebrow. All of them? Eventually. Claire answered from the other end of the table. He kept sending food back. Richard looked annoyed. I had standards. Claire took a sip of tea. You had grief. Silence. Richard did not argue. Annie looked around the room again. The house suddenly felt different. Not empty. Lonely. Her eyes landed on a framed photograph near the shelf. The same woman from the picture. Richard's mother. Beside her stood a young Richard in an oversized apron. Annie smiled. You cooked together. Richard followed her gaze. Every Sunday. Marcus looked up. Richard set his fork down. She couldn't afford babysitters. He smiled faintly. So I learned recipes. What was the first thing you made? Annie asked. He looked toward the kitchen. Burned biscuits. Marcus laughed. Welcome to the club. Richard nodded. My mother ate them anyway. The room softened. Claire stood and quietly brought dessert plates. Richard frowned. What's that? She smiled. Insurance. She opened the dish Marcus had brought. Mrs. Carter's peach cobbler. Marcus laughed under his breath. Woman plans ahead. Claire served everyone. Richard took a bite. Stopped. Annie noticed it immediately. He looked down at the cobbler, then toward Marcus. She uses nutmeg. Marcus blinked. How'd you know? My mother did too. The room fell quiet. Richard put the fork down. He stood suddenly. Nobody moved. He walked to a cabinet near the living room. Opened it. Reached inside. When he returned, he carried a small wooden box. Old. Worn at the corners. He set it on the table. Claire looked surprised. I haven't seen that in years. Richard opened it. Recipe cards. Dozens. Yellowed with age. Handwritten. His mother's. Annie leaned forward. The top card read, Sunday bread pudding. Marcus went still. Richard handed it to him. Marcus read silently, then looked up. This is almost the same. Richard nodded. Not exact. No. Marcus turned the card over. But close. Annie looked between them. Richard smiled faintly. Poor people invent similar recipes. Marcus laughed quietly. Yeah. Richard touched the edge of the box. I haven't opened this since the funeral. Claire lowered her eyes. Annie looked at him. Why now? He thought for a moment. Because last week a girl in my restaurant told me ruined things still have stories left. Annie smiled. I didn't say that. No. Richard looked toward Marcus. Your wife did. Nobody spoke. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked softly. Outside, the water moved against the docks. Inside, 4 people sat around old recipes and dessert. Marcus carefully returned the card. Richard closed the box. Then he looked at Annie. The board interview. Marcus immediately straightened. Richard noticed. It's your choice. Annie nodded. I know. I mean really your choice. He held her gaze. No debt. No obligation. No paying me back. Marcus relaxed slightly. Richard continued. If you say no, the scholarship stays open. Annie frowned. What? Claire smiled. He argued with the board. Richard looked annoyed again. I negotiated. Claire shook her head. He threatened to fund it himself. Marcus stared. Richard took another bite of cobbler. It worked. Nobody knew what to say. Finally, Marcus leaned back in his chair. You're a strange man. Richard looked up. Marcus smiled. Good strange. For the first time since Annie had met him, Richard laughed without holding anything back. Not the sharp laugh from the restaurant. Not the cold one. A real laugh. The sound surprised even him. Later, when dinner ended and dishes were stacked, Annie stood alone near the kitchen island. Richard joined her. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he placed the wooden recipe box beside her. Annie looked up. You forgot this. No. She blinked. Richard rested one hand on the lid. I want you to borrow it. Anya started. Why? He looked toward the dining room where Marcus and Claire were arguing politely over dishes. Because I think recipes should visit people who understand them. Annie touched the box carefully. Richard smiled faintly. And because I finally trust someone else with my mother. Annie carried the wooden recipe box home on her lap. Marcus drove in silence. Not uncomfortable silence. Careful silence. The kind people used around old photographs in hospital rooms. The streetlights slid across the windshield one by one. Finally, Marcus spoke. You know what that means, right? Annie looked down at the box. No, it means he trusts you. She touched the worn edge with her thumb. That feels heavy. Marcus smiled faintly. Good things usually are. At home, she carried it straight to the kitchen table. The recipe book already sat there. Her mother's book. Richard's box. 2 kitchens meeting across years and grief. Marcus hung his keys by the door. You opening it tonight? Annie nodded. He pulled out 2 mugs. Then I'm making coffee. They sat at the table after midnight. Outside, the neighborhood had gone quiet. Inside, only the kitchen light remained on. Annie opened the box carefully. Recipe cards, notes, old grocery receipts folded between pages. A photograph of Richard at maybe 12 standing beside his mother. He was smiling. Wide, unprotected. Marcus picked it up. Poor kid. Annie looked over. What? Marcus turned the picture in his hands. People who lose good mothers carry it forever. The words landed softly. Annie kept sorting. One card read, apple butter biscuits. Another, Sunday roast potatoes. Then one smaller card slipped free. No recipe, only handwriting. Richard hates peaches unless they're cooked. Annie smiled. Marcus laughed quietly. She wrote notes. Annie kept reading. Buy cinnamon on Thursday. Fix apron pocket. Tell Richard he is enough. The room went still. Marcus lowered his eyes. Annie read the line again. Tell Richard he is enough. Folded beneath it was another paper. A letter. Not finished. The writing stopped halfway. Richard, if I ever leave before you're ready. Annie stopped breathing. Marcus looked up immediately. What is it? She handed him the page. He read quietly. The unfinished letter ended after 3 paragraphs. No signature. No ending. Just one final sentence. Don't become so successful that you forget how we survived. Marcus sat back slowly. The kitchen stayed silent. Annie carefully returned the letter to the box. At that exact moment, her phone buzzed. Claire. Annie answered. Hello? Sorry to call late. Annie glanced at Marcus. It's okay. Claire sounded tired. Mr. Whitmore forgot his watch. Annie frowned. What? The silver one. Marcus looked over. He left it in the kitchen. Annie sat up. Should I bring it tomorrow? Silence. Then Claire said quietly, "He's looking for it." Something in her voice changed the room. "What happened?" Claire exhaled. "He had a panic attack." Marcus straightened. Annie gripped the phone. "What?" "He hasn't had one in years." The kitchen felt smaller suddenly. Claire continued softly. "The birthday was harder than he expected." Annie looked at the recipe box, the photograph, the unfinished letter. "Is he okay?" "He will be." A pause. "He asked if you still had the box." Annie looked down. "Yes." Claire's voice lowered. "He thinks the letter is inside." Marcus looked at Annie immediately. Annie swallowed. "I found it." Silence. Claire spoke carefully. "Please don't read it over the phone." "I wouldn't." Another pause. Then quietly, "Thank you." The call ended. Marcus leaned back. "He left the watch and the letter?" Annie nodded. Marcus rubbed one hand across his face. "He trusted too much tonight." "No," Annie said softly. Marcus looked up. He remembered too much. The next morning, Magnolia Crown was already busy when they arrived. Richard was there, not in the dining room. In the kitchen, alone. He stood near the prep station holding a cup of coffee. The silver watch was gone. He looked tired. Claire stood nearby pretending not to worry. Richard turned when Annie walked in. His eyes immediately moved to the wooden box in her arms. Nobody spoke. Annie stepped closer, then held it out. Richard did not take it. "Did you read it?" The question was quiet. Annie nodded once. Marcus stayed beside her. Richard lowered his eyes. "My mother never finished anything when she got sick." The kitchen noise seemed farther away. He finally took the box. His fingers rested on the lid. "I thought I lost that letter." Annie looked at him. "I think she finished it anyway." Richard frowned. Annie touched the box gently. "She raised you." Silence. Marcus looked down. Richard did not move. Annie continued softly. She didn't need to finish the sentence. The kitchen stayed still. Then Richard laughed once. Small, broken. "You sound like your mother." Marcus smiled. "She gets that a lot." Richard opened the box. The letter still rested inside. He touched the folded paper but did not take it out. Instead, he closed the lid again, then looked at Annie. "The board moved your interview." Marcus immediately straightened. "When?" 2 weeks. The room changed again. Annie blinked. "That fast?" Richard nodded. "They want to meet the girl who turned stale bread into diplomacy." Ray walked past carrying potatoes. "You also made him cry twice," he added. Chef Daniel yelled from the back. "Ray, just helping." The kitchen laughed softly. The heaviness eased. Richard looked at Annie one more time. 2 weeks, he repeated. Then at Marcus. "She'll be ready." Marcus answered without hesitation. "I know," but Annie saw it again. The thing behind his smile. Pride. And the beginning of goodbye. 2 weeks. The number followed Annie all day. 2 weeks, while peeling apples. 2 weeks while carrying trays. 2 weeks while folding napkins after service. Every time she looked up, the white chef jacket hanging near Chef Daniel's office seemed closer. By evening, Magnolia Crown had quieted. Marcus was finishing paperwork in the office. Chef Daniel had gone home. Ray was arguing with a dishwasher about football near the back sink. Annie stayed at the prep table practicing knife cuts. Claire entered carrying a folder. "You're still here." Annie looked up. "You too." Claire placed the folder down. "Interview prep." Annie frowned. "For me?" Claire nodded. Inside were pages. Foundation history. Sample questions. Scholarship criteria. Annie turned a page. Leadership. Technique. Personal statement. Future goals. Her stomach tightened. "What if I mess this up?" Claire pulled out a chair. "Then you mess it up." Annie blinked. "That's your advice?" Claire smiled slightly. "I work with billionaires. They fail all the time. They just wear better watches." Annie laughed. Claire leaned back. "You know what Mr. Whitmore did at his first culinary competition?" "What?" "He forgot salt." "Anya started. He came in last." "No way." Claire nodded. "He didn't cook for 6 months after." The kitchen noise softened around them. Annie looked down at the papers. "He seems like someone who always wins." Claire looked toward the dining room. "He became someone who hates losing." The words stayed there. Annie closed the folder. "What was he like before?" Claire thought for a moment. "Hungry. For success?" "No." She smiled faintly. "For people." The back office door opened. Marcus walked out carrying receipts. He stopped when he saw the folder. What's that? Interview prep, Annie answered. Marcus sat down beside her. The pages suddenly looked more real. He turned one over. Future goals. Marcus read silently, then asked, "What do you want?" Annie looked at him. "I don't know." "Yes, you do." The kitchen quieted again. Ray stopped pretending not to listen. Annie stared at the page. "I want to cook." Marcus nodded. "I know. I want my own kitchen someday." "I know. I want people to remember meals." Marcus smiled. "I know that too." She hesitated. "And I don't want you left behind." Marcus's smile faded. Ray immediately looked away and resumed scrubbing a pan that was already clean. Marcus folded the paper slowly. "Come with me." They stepped outside behind the restaurant. The alley was cool. Delivery crates sat stacked near the wall. The city hummed beyond the buildings. Marcus leaned against his old truck. "You remember your first bike?" Annie frowned. "The blue one? You crashed it into Mrs. Carter's mailbox." "She moved it." Marcus laughed. "You cried for an hour because you thought I'd be mad." Annie smiled. "You know what I told you?" She nodded. "Get back on." Marcus looked at her. "That's still my answer." The alley grew quiet. "You leaving isn't leaving me behind." Annie looked down. "It feels like it." "No." He shook his head. "It feels like growing." She stayed silent. Marcus looked toward Magnolia Crown. "I spent years trying to keep life from taking things from us." He smiled softly. "Then one day you walked into a kitchen and gave us something back." Annie's eyes lowered. "You're allowed to go farther than me." The back door opened. Richard stepped outside carrying 2 takeout cups. Both turned. He looked between them. "Bad timing?" Marcus wiped one hand over his face. "Depends what's in the cups." "Coffee." Marcus relaxed immediately. "Good timing." Richard handed him one. The 3 stood beside the truck. No suite. No investors. Just evening. Richard looked at Annie. "Claire gave you the prep folder." She nodded. "You scared?" "Yes." "Good." Annie frowned. He took a sip of coffee. "People who aren't scared stop learning." Marcus smiled into his cup. Richard leaned against the truck. "When I was 19, I got accepted into culinary school." Annie looked up. "I almost didn't go." Marcus frowned. "Why?" "My mother was sick." Richard stared toward the street. "I thought leaving meant betrayal." Silence. Annie looked at him. "What changed?" He smiled faintly. "She lied." Marcus laughed softly. "What?" "She told me she hated cooking." He shook his head. "Worst lie she ever told." Annie smiled. Richard continued. "She looked at me and said, 'Go before grief convinces you to stay.'" Nobody spoke. The alley felt smaller suddenly. Richard looked at Annie. "You know what happened?" "What?" "I went." "And?" He looked toward the kitchen windows. "And I still carried her with me." The back door opened again. Ray leaned out. "Marcus, Chef Daniel says stop having emotional conversations and come inventory potatoes." Marcus groaned. Richard laughed. Ray looked at him. "You too, rich guy." Richard blinked. "Me?" "Everybody works tonight." Marcus was already laughing. Richard shook his head. "I own restaurants." Ray shrugged. "Tonight, you count potatoes." For the first time in years, Richard Whitmore obeyed someone without arguing. Inside Magnolia Crown, 4 people counted potatoes under fluorescent lights. Outside, Charleston settled into night, and somewhere between coffee, memories, and crates of produce, Annie felt the fear shift. It was still there, but it no longer stood in front of her. It stood beside her. The interview room overlooked the harbor. Annie noticed the water first, then the silence. Whitmore Culinary Foundation occupied the top floor of an old brick building downtown. The lobby smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. Photographs of students lined the hallway. Young chefs, graduates, scholarship recipients. Annie stood near the window holding the prep folder Claire had given her. Marcus sat beside her. Suit jacket, polished shoes, nervous hands. "You keep bouncing your knee," Annie whispered. "I know. You're making me nervous." "I'm already nervous." Annie smiled. Across the room, Richard stood near the coffee station reading something on his tablet. Dark suit, silver watch back on his wrist. Different room. Same quiet. Claire walked over. "They're ready." Marcus stood immediately. Claire smiled. "Not you." He stopped. "What?" "Interview is candidates only." Marcus looked at Annie. The room changed. Annie had known this. Still, Seeing it happen felt different. Marcus stood there for a second too long. Then he nodded. Okay. Annie reached for the folder. Marcus caught her wrist gently. Hey. She looked up. You remember your mother's recipe? Annie smiled. Every line. Good. He stepped back. Then go cook with your mouth. Claire laughed quietly. Richard almost smiled. The conference room was smaller than Annie expected. 3 board members sat inside. Chef Linda Price, former culinary instructor. Thomas Green, foundation director. Martha Ellis, donor representative. A pitcher of water sat in the center. An empty chair waited. Annie sat. Chef Linda looked down at the file. Annie Johnson, Charleston, Magnolia Crown apprentice. Annie nodded. Thomas folded his hands. We've heard a lot about you. Annie glanced toward the glass wall. Richard stood outside now. He looked away immediately. Martha smiled. Relax. We're not scary. Chef Linda disagreed immediately. We are a little scary. The room laughed. The tension eased. Questions started simply. Cooking background. Family. School. Training. Annie answered steadily. Then Thomas asked, why cooking? The room quieted. Annie looked at her hands. My mom died when I was 9. Nobody moved. She used to save everything. Bread, fruit, leftovers. Annie smiled faintly. She said wasting food was easy. Feeding people was harder. Chef Linda nodded slowly. Annie continued, my dad raised me in kitchens after she passed. She looked up. Cooking became the place where she still existed. Silence. Martha lowered her pen. Thomas asked softly, and what do you want now? Annie thought about Magnolia Crown. The truck. The apron. The recipe book. Richard's letter. Marcus counting potatoes. I want people to feel less alone when they eat. Nobody wrote for several seconds. Then Chef Linda leaned forward. What would you do with this scholarship? Annie opened the folder. Inside sat the white jacket photo Claire had slipped in earlier. Whitmore Culinary Foundation candidate. She touched it once. I'd learn. Chef Linda waited. Annie smiled. And then I'd come home. Outside the glass wall, Marcus lowered his eyes. Richard noticed. Inside, Martha looked up. You'd come back? Yes. Why? Annie answered without hesitation. Because somebody stayed for me. The room became still. Outside, Marcus looked away completely. Richard stood beside him now. Neither spoke. Inside the interview, Thomas closed the file. Chef Linda removed her glasses. Martha smiled. Well, Annie frowned. Well, what? Chef Linda looked at the others. Then at Annie. I think we're done. Annie blinked. That's it? Thomas laughed. Did you want an essay section? The door opened. Annie stepped out. Marcus stood immediately. How was it? She shrugged. I don't know. Chef Linda appeared behind her. You did fine. Marcus straightened. Fina? Chef Linda smiled. Your daughter talks like a chef already. Marcus looked at Annie. Pride arrived before words did. The board disappeared down the hall. Claire handed Annie water. Richard remained near the window. Quiet, watching the harbor. Annie walked over. You knew the questions. He looked at her. No, you didn't. I only knew the person answering. She smiled. Marcus joined them. Well? Richard checked his watch. They'll vote by evening. Marcus exhaled. Annie nodded. The elevator doors opened behind them. Chef Linda stepped back out. Everyone turned. She looked directly at Annie. One more question. Annie blinked. What? Chef Linda smiled. If you get accepted. The room waited. What would you name your first restaurant? Marcus looked at Annie. Richard looked at her too. Annie thought for only a second. Second chance. Silence. Chef Linda smiled. Good answer. She stepped back into the elevator. The doors closed. Nobody moved. Claire quietly wiped one eye. Marcus laughed softly. Richard looked out toward the harbor again. Far below, boats moved through the water. Beside him stood a girl who had turned ruined bread into memory. And somewhere in Charleston, a future had just spoken its own name. The call came at 7:14 that evening. Annie was drying dishes. Marcus was pretending to read bills at the kitchen table. The phone rang once. Both looked at it. Nobody moved. It rang again. Marcus pointed. Answer it before I pass out. Annie laughed and picked up. Hello? Annie Johnson? Chef Linda Price. Annie straightened. Yes, ma'am. Marcus stood immediately. Chef Linda smiled through the phone. Annie could hear it. I'm calling on behalf of Whitmore Culinary Foundation. The room went silent. We would like to offer you the scholarship. Annie stopped breathing. Marcus gripped the back of the chair. It includes tuition, housing, mentorship, travel support, and placement opportunities. Annie looked at her father. He had already lowered his head. Chef Linda continued, "You earned this." Annie swallowed. "Thank you." "No," Chef Linda said softly. "Thank your parents." The call ended. The kitchen stayed still. Annie looked up. Marcus wiped his face before she could see it. Too late. She had. "Dad." He laughed once. "You got in." Annie crossed the room. Marcus hugged her before she reached him. The same hug. Graduations. Funerals. Miracles. "You got in," he repeated quietly. The front porch creaked. Mrs. Carter appeared at the window. "Did she get in?" Marcus pointed at the door. "How long have you been standing there?" "Long enough." She walked in carrying pie. Again, Annie laughed through tears. "You always have dessert." Mrs. Carter set it down. "Baby, this neighborhood raised you. We celebrate carbohydrates." The phone rang again. "Claire." Annie answered. "Hello." "We heard." Annie smiled. "That fast?" "Mr. Whitmore has already called 3 people and canceled 1 meeting." Marcus laughed. Claire lowered her voice. "He wants to see you both tonight." "Tonight?" "Yes." "Where?" "Magnolia Crown." Annie frowned. "The restaurant's closed Sundays." Claire smiled. "Not tonight." 30 minutes later, they pulled into the parking lot. Lights glowed inside Magnolia Crown. Music drifted softly through the windows. Marcus slowed. "What is this?" They stepped inside. Everyone was there. Chef Daniel, Ray, the servers, dishwashers. Mrs. Carter somehow arrived before them. A banner hung over the dining room. "Congratulations, Annie." Annie covered her mouth. Ray immediately pointed at himself. "I helped hang it." Chef Daniel snorted. "You hung it crooked. Artistic choice." Laughter moved through the room. Richard stood near the center table. No suit jacket. Sleeves rolled. He looked almost uncomfortable with the celebration. Claire handed Annie an envelope. She opened it. Inside sat a photograph. Magnolia Crown Kitchen. Her first day. Marcus beside her. Chef Daniel behind them. Richard in the doorway from that first night. On the back was handwriting. "For the girl who turned a mistake into a future." Annie looked up. Richard shrugged slightly. "Claire made me sentimental." Claire rolled her eyes. "You cried over peaches." The room laughed. Marcus moved beside Annie. Richard cleared his throat. "There's one more thing." The room quieted. He pulled out another envelope. "Smaller." Marcus frowned. Richard handed it to him. Marcus opened it. "Silence." He read it again, then looked up. "What is this?" Chef Daniel smiled. Richard answered simply. "Your promotion contract." Marcus blinked. "Assistant kitchen manager?" Chef Daniel shook his head. "No." Marcus looked again. "Kitchen operations director. Magnolia Crown." The room exploded. Ray shouted. Mrs. Carter clapped first. Marcus just stood there. "No." Richard nodded. "Yes. I didn't ask for this. You earned it." Marcus looked at Chef Daniel. Daniel smiled. "Told them I'm getting old." "You're not old. I counted potatoes with a billionaire." Daniel shrugged. "I've done enough." Laughter again. Marcus sat down suddenly. Annie knelt beside him. "Dad?" He laughed through tears. "Your mother is showing off." Nobody spoke, because somehow, everyone believed him. Richard walked over. He placed something on the table. The silver watch. Marcus looked up. Richard smiled faintly. "Tomorrow I'm taking a cooking lesson." Annie laughed. "With who?" He looked at Marcus. "You." Marcus blinked. "What?" "I still burn the edges." Chef Daniel muttered. "That part I believe." The room laughed again. Dinner followed. Simple food. Stories. Too much dessert. Ray told the bread pudding story wrong again. Mrs. Carter corrected him twice. At the end of the night, people began leaving. Chairs emptied. Lights dimmed. Only a few remained. Annie stood alone near the kitchen pass. Richard joined her. The restaurant was quiet again. He looked around Magnolia Crown. "You know," he said softly, "I almost walked away from this place." Annie looked at him. "I know." He nodded. "Would have been the worst investment decision of my life." She smiled. "Because of the money?" He looked toward the kitchen where Marcus and Chef Daniel were talking. "No, His eyes moved to the old bread station. The people, the lights lowered another shade. Outside, Charleston settled into night. Inside Magnolia Crown, a restaurant that had almost lost everything was still standing. And at the center of it stood a father, a daughter, and a man who had finally remembered home. 3 weeks later, Magnolia Crown closed early. The sign on the front door read, "Private event." Inside the dining room, candles glowed across the tables. Fresh flowers sat near the windows. The old brick walls carried the smell of butter, cinnamon, and warm bread. Annie stood in the kitchen wearing the white chef jacket. Whitmore Culinary Foundation candidate. Tomorrow she would leave for orientation. Tonight was goodbye. Marcus adjusted his tie for the third time. Mrs. Carter slapped his hand away. "You look fine. I'm her father. I'm allowed to panic. You've been panicking since breakfast." Ray walked past carrying rolls. "He's been panicking since chapter 1. Chef Daniel pointed a spoon at him. "Work." The dining room slowly filled. Staff, neighbors, church friends, people who had watched Annie grow up. Richard arrived last. No suit tonight, just a dark sweater and the silver watch. He stopped when he saw Annie in the jacket. For a second he said nothing. Then quietly, "It fits." Annie smiled. "Thanks." Dinner moved slowly. Stories, laughter, too much food. Mrs. Carter cried twice and denied both. Halfway through dessert, Chef Daniel stood. The room quieted. He looked at Annie. "I've worked kitchens 42 years. Ray whispered, "Speech time." Daniel ignored him. "I taught soldiers, apprentices, hotheads." He glanced toward Marcus. "And one stubborn father." The room laughed. Daniel continued, "Talent matters, skill matters." He looked at Annie. "But character keeps people fed." Silence settled. He reached into his jacket. A chef knife. Old, worn handle. He placed it in front of Annie. Marcus looked up sharply. Annie froze. Daniel smiled. "My mentor gave me that in 1989. The room became still. "You take care of it." Annie swallowed. "I can't." "Yes, you can." Marcus lowered his eyes. Richard watched quietly. After dinner, people drifted toward the dining room. Only a few remained in the kitchen. Marcus stood by the old bread station. Annie joined him. "You okay?" He smiled. "No." She laughed softly. Marcus touched the counter. "Your mother stood right there the first time she visited." Annie looked over. "She told me this kitchen was too small for my dreams." "What did you say?" "I said rent was cheap." They both laughed. Marcus reached into his pocket, folded paper. He handed it to her. Annie opened it. Her mother's handwriting. The page from the recipe book. Second chance bread. Underneath, a line she had never seen. For Annie, her hands trembled. Marcus looked away. "I found it tucked inside the back cover." Annie kept reading. "If you ever cook this without me, don't be sad. It means life carried you somewhere beautiful." The kitchen disappeared for a second. Marcus wiped his eyes. "Your mother always knew." Behind them, footsteps approached. Richard stood holding a small box. Wood. Wern. His mother's recipe box. Annie looked up. "You should keep it." He shook his head. "No." He set it beside her mother's page. "My mother kept recipes." He nodded toward Marcus. "Your mother kept hope." Then toward Annie. "You keep both." Silence settled over the kitchen. 3 lives. 3 kitchens. 1 table. Ray suddenly appeared at the doorway. "Nobody told me this scene was emotional." Mrs. Carter pulled him away by the sleeve. "Come help with dishes. I'm supporting art." The room laughed again. The heaviness softened. Later, when everyone had gone, Annie stepped back into the empty dining room. Chairs sat upside down on tables. Candles had burned low. Magnolia Crown was quiet. Richard stood near the front door. Marcus beside him. Neither spoke. Annie walked over. Richard looked at her. "You know what my mother used to say?" Annie shook her head. He smiled faintly. "She said some meals feed the body." Marcus looked up. Richard continued softly. "The rare ones bring people home." Nobody moved. Outside, Charleston slept. Inside Magnolia Crown, a restaurant that almost lost everything had become something else. A memory. A promise. A second chance. Annie looked back one last time. The bread station. The kitchen lights. Her father. The place where everything started. Tomorrow she would leave. But tonight she was still here. Still the girl who believed ruined things could become beautiful. And somewhere between stale bread and $1 million promise, She had been right. This story reminds us that mistakes do not define a person. Sometimes, what looks ruined is only waiting for someone to give it a second chance. Kindness, memory, family, and quiet sacrifice can change lives more than money ever will. And no matter how far we go, the people who loved and believed in us remain the true recipe behind our success. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.